All right, so today we are here to talk about Vina Das's disorders of desire or moral striving, engaging the life of the other. Before we get into it, I want to suggest that there might be one um, helpful way of approaching this. So in moral philosophy, you get thought experiments to sort of test our moral intuitions. So the trolley problem is probably the most famous one. Very briefly, you're by a train track. You're at a switch that can divert the train to the left or to the right. Currently, it's diverted to the left. Down that track, there are five children inexplicably playing on the track. And to the right, you have one guy who is, I don't know, doing track work or something. And you can either pull the switch to divert the train so that it won't run over the five children, but will run over the other fellow. And so clearly it will kill him. And so the first iteration of this is to work out what's your moral intuition. Save the five children, kill the one, or just let the trolley do what it's going to do and not intervene. The second iteration would be a similar one. Now you're on a bridge over the tracks. The trolley is coming. Again, five kids down on the tracks further down. They can't hear the trolley coming for whatever reason. But there's one huge guy sitting on the railing of the bridge. And if you push that guy off onto the tracks in front of the trolley will kill him, but it will get knocked off the tracks, and so it won't kill the five kids. And so, again, the idea here is to test your moral intuitions and see, do your moral intuitions change from the one example to the other? Does actually putting your hands on this fellow to push him over change your intuitions? And more or less, it's kind of asking you if you're a utilitarian, favoring the well-being of five over the one, or if you're like a Kantian deontologist who will say, well, no, murder is murder, and that is not a principle of action that you can stand behind under any circumstances. Okay, the point being that within moral philosophy, you often get these kinds of thought experiments that are abstractions of what it is to be moral, right? They're asking you to test your moral sensibility against abstractions. A way of reading Das's essay then is to think of her as looking for a different kind of sight of moral or ethical contemplation, turning it, descending, she will say, into the ordinary to see where it is that ethics or moral considerations appear in everyday life. And so then trying to grapple with what the implications are for the way that we think of ethics and morals. She opens the chapter with the following question. If everyday life is the site on which the life of the other is engaged, how are unexpected events, such as falling in love with the wrong kind of person, absorbed within kinship relations, for love to flower in the space of the domestic? We might think of this then, on the one hand, as giving us not so much a definition of the everyday as providing us with one of its criteria. So the everyday in this view, or according to this criterion, is where we engage the life of the other. In this case, engagement will concern the flexibility of kinship and will be an opportunity to think about the notion of moral striving that interests Das. So again, I direct your attention to the idea that moral striving as something that occurs within everyday life rather than something that we latch onto through thought experiments and abstractions. Desire, in this case, can be both disruptive at the level of norms, or I dare say at politics, as we'll see, but also creative in spurring expression that goes beyond social expectations and responsibilities. She writes, this view of moral life is deeply influenced by a notion of the everyday in which how I respond to claims of the other, as well as how I allow myself to be claimed by the other, defines the work of self-formation. This language of self-formation, um, sort of having a kinship with notions of technologies of the self, might evoke the sorts of virtue ethics we find in anthropological work that draws from Foucault or Aristotle, but Das has something else in mind. Understandings of self-formation that aspire toward an ideal that is given in advance share something with the view of morality as adherence to rules, or morality as grounded in judgment, in prioritizing an abstract vantage point. They, in this way, they can obscure whole regions of moral life as people live them in everyday life. And so this is the sort of notion of morality that Das is wary of adopting. She takes this caution to apply that an exclusive focus on forming moral judgments, quote, in which the crucial requirement is that we should be able to take an abstract, non-subjective vantage point from which we can orient ourselves to the world, could equally provide a cover for evading the imperative to be attentive to the suffering of the other. Rather than thinking of morality on the model of a rule that projects itself as if on rails infinitely into the future, a model also that Wittgenstein critiques when thinking about what it is to follow a rule, when Das appeals to Foucault, it is specifically to this idea of eventalization, his idea of eventalization, to help us consider the singularity of any case we feel tempted to judge under a general moral precept. Instead, we may attend to the specific forces, desires, strategies, and so forth that have gone into shaping it as a singularity, rather than as just another example of a general tendency, right? So therefore not bringing it under this kind of teleological rubric that some people, some anthropologists and some philosophers find more appealing in Foucault. Das characterizes the singularity of the scene she will describe in this way. I hope to show how something as simple as a Hindu boy having fallen in love with a Muslim girl becomes a seed scattered in the soil of the everyday. It carries within it the potential to unleash great violence, but also carries an opportunity for intimate aspirations to be realized by all who have to recreate their relationships around the couple. Her aim then is to show a certain picture of moral perfectionism, a notion that she inherits from Emerson and from Cavell's writing on Emerson about moral perfectionism. One of striving amid uncertainty, doubt, and deepening intimacy for an adjacent self, which is not the same as pursuing a higher self or deliverance to a new self. So pursuing an adjacent self, and how this enables a calming of the relationship's turbulent potential, this violent potential in Hindu-Muslim love relationships, as it wove through fraught Hindu-Muslim politics, police investigation, court cases, and parliamentary inquiries. Das notes long-standing but countervailing phenomena surrounding the potential for violence in Hindu-Muslim relations involving the sexuality of women. On the one hand, there's this long tradition of mutual insults between Hindus and Muslims, emasculating the men of the other group, denigrating the purity of the women in both directions. On the other, there is, she says, the theme of desire that crosses the normative boundaries of religion, appearing in literature, film, and poetry. Hence, Das asks, within this field of desire, fraught with the possibilities of tremendous violence, how are loving couples enabled to negotiate the treacherous waters of Hindu-Muslim sensibility, the difficult realm of law, and the dense kinship universe of each person? The law, we find, has long been ambivalent on Hindu-Muslim marriages, so dating to the colonial period. So that, for example, the Special Marriage Act of 1872 protected marriages conducted without parental consent, so of individuals who were of age but who were marrying without parental consent, but only as long as the marrying individuals renounced membership in any religious community. So then they weren't marrying as a Hindu and a Muslim, they were marrying as two individuals who were detached from any religious community. The law, however, is not the only example of ambivalence. So in his contemporary work, Brigu Singh recounts in Shabad, Hyderabad province, which is where the pin drop is, the sorts of taunts, insults, and sexual innuendos mentioned before were present, but, Das says, Singh captures the uncertainties, the courting of risks that might enhance the pleasures of agonistic intimacies or turn into feuds among neighboring villages or caste groups. There is much showing off, but also much heartbreak. Perhaps the most important thing, though, is that it was obvious to anyone in the neighborhoods where Kuldeep and Saba, the couple in question, and their families lived, that Hindu Muslim marriages could spark violence. So it wasn't as if they were pursuing this course of action naively, unaware of the potentials. No, they were acutely aware of them, as you see from the chapter, um, but they were willing to pursue marriage anyway, or they were willing to pursue their love relationship. Das takes as an example of this, the publicity of this threat, a pamphlet circulated by the student wing of the BJP, the BJP being one of the two main political parties in India. And it's the party currently under in government under Modi. This pamphlet sounded alarm about what it called love jihad, an Islamist conspiracy to trap naive Hindu girls in the web of love to convert to Islam, having won their consent to marriage. The courts have a role in this story as well, in that it stems from a case in which Hindu parents alleged that two young Muslim men had kidnapped their daughters in order to convert them. An ensuing police investigation into that pair of cases found no love jihad organization, but the militant group Sri Ram Sene nonetheless promised to send activists to Kerala to monitor suspicious activities of couples and interrupt any love jihad activity, which is to say, any activity they suspected of being love jihad activity. Das's point is that the suspicion of and threats to marriages that cut across religious groups was well publicized in the communities in which Kuldeep and Saba circulated. With this general environment clarified, it's not entirely surprising when Das learns from Kuldeep's aunt that, having married a Muslim girl, Kuldeep faces charges of abduction lodged by her parents and threats from them, in particular from the father, against his life. In addition, though, we learn that Kuldip has dropped out of the technical institute where he studied. So he it would have allowed him to become like an electrical technician or something of that sort. Um, but he drops out of that school because has the aspiration to open his own tutorial college. He's persuaded that if he can open his own tutorial college, he'll make more money that way. So he and a friend have taken out loans in order to get this college started. But his friend runs off with the money, and so Kuldip is left holding the bag from moneylenders and from members of the RSS, who I just cited a moment ago, the ones who are going to monitor love jihad activity. Part of the trouble here is that the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh is a BJP affiliated Hindu nationalist group that uses intimidation to prevent cross religious marriages. So, having their attention in a moment when he's pursuing a love relationship with a Muslim girl, that's not a good moment to do that, right? He does not want their attention. As Kuldip and Saba recount the story of their falling in love, though, it's also clear that they were concerned about how their relationship would upset family members, specifically on the count of loving across the religious divide. So it's not just the threats from outside the family that are a problem, it's also the sentiments of family members, as we see from the threat leveled against Kuldip by Saba's father. They could anticipate some potential threats and thus approached the police through a lawyer to leave written statements that Saba was leaving willingly to marry Kuldip. They also left copies of these letters with friends. So they were taking this precaution against the charge of abduction that, in fact, Saba's parents do level against Kuldip. Further, knowing that groups like the RSS monitored the court bonds where everyone seeking a civil marriage would have to declare their intentions 30 days in advance, they arranged for a local Arya Samaj priest to convert Saba to Hinduism and to perform the marriage ceremony. In this way, they don't need to post 30 days ahead of their intention to have a civil marriage. They can simply register this Hindu marriage and not have to go through this whole court procedure, and therefore not have to expose themselves to the possibility that an RSS member will catch their ban when they post it 30 days in advance. Notably, Kuldip encouraged Saba not to take the conversion too seriously. It was only a means to an end, facilitating their marriage, a sentiment he replicated when considering his own conversion to Islam. Although the Mufti who would oversee his conversion required 3 months of study of the Quran to demonstrate his sincerity, Kuldip admitted to Das that these conversions were all ways of mitigating risk on, we see, either side of the religious divide. And what's interesting, though, is that Saba begins to perform puja, a Hindu form of ritual worship, being careful, though, to avoid prostrating herself before another god in order to remain a faithful Muslim, while on the other hand, Kuldip asks Saba to teach him the proper forms of Islamic prayer. So it seems then that they're not just doing this all for show for others, that in fact they start to take interest in each other's religious observances and practices. Arguably, then, and this is the point that Das is making, is that this has to do with responsiveness to the other. Because the religion of each is important to each, then they take interest in the other's religion because it is important to one another. This sort of flexibility toward religious performance may have a pragmatic or instrumental dimension to it. They both say this quite openly. But it turns out also to reflect a flexibility of religious identity on both sides that arises from each of them caring about the other's religious life and practices enough to experiment beyond his or her own faith and tradition. The flexibility between Kuldip and Saba had parallel development in Kuldip's family. Das gives more than one example, but I just give the one for the sake of brevity. It turned out that each person in the family was willing to make slow shifts in his or her orientation to the divine, to prayer, and to ritual performances, as well as adjustments in the questions of to which community he or she belonged. Kuldip's mother became closer to the goddess as she tried to see that anything that angered the goddess in relation to the presence of a Muslim girl in the home was somehow neutralized. Right? So that on the one hand, then, this is a certain kind of expression of concern for the goddess, but on the other hand, this is also an expression of concern for Saba in Kuldip's mother's household. It seems to me that we can see these as subtle but significant shifts in ethical life, both as examples of responsiveness to others and in relation to divinity. Absorbing the concerns of another into your life is not, however, without risks. Not surprisingly, everyday life is not without risks. And after Saba and Kuldip fled following threats of violence from the creditors, Kuldip's creditors, his family was forced by the creditors to accept renters on the top floor of their home until Kuldip's debt was paid. So Kuldip and Saba had fled to another neighborhood by Saba's family, a Muslim neighborhood where they could live. But Kuldip's family then was left in this position of still being exposed to Kuldip's creditors, the creditors feeling comfortable with the idea that they could extract payment from Kuldip's family and that would be as satisfying for them as getting it from Kuldip himself. Despite this pressure on Kuldip's family and on Saba's kin, with, as I say, with whom they went to live during this time, the families, that is, Kuldip's family and Saba's family, engaged in small but important gestures like sending sweets for each other's major religious festivals. So again, this is in part giving recognition to the other religious communities, um, to those things that are important in the other religious community, but it's also a way of trying to knit the families into one another so that they might have a future together. We can already see how everyday life for Kuldip and Saba was insecure. So from where they could safely live turned out not to be Kuldip's family's house for a time, to the receptiveness of family, which was in no way guaranteed, hence the threats from Saba's parents to Kuldip's economic and debt woes. So in some sense, we can already see that the preservation of everyday life was, on several identifiable fronts, an achievement. It was perilous, and so maintaining everyday life took work. It did not just run itself. In this section, though, Das wants to get a sharper picture of the everyday and, thus, against what threats and disruptions it is an achievement. So against what threats do we need to shore up everyday life? She starts with the observation that events that are large enough to break into the public realm, so in other works she's written about, for example, communal violence, These are things that break into the public realm. Um, that these sorts of things have both precedents, things leading up to them, and they have an afterlife. Even though to detect the afterlife of these large scale events, she says we must wait patiently to see how something new might be born, right? That we can't simply predict in advance the way in which a large scale event is going to make its way into the everyday lives of the people who carry on after it, and what sorts of modifications will appear in their lives, how newness will arise within their lives that is connected to these large scale events. With Kuldeep and Saba, there is not, however, one momentous conversion. So it's not like there is a turning point where one mode of life switches into another. Rather, there's a gradual process of discovery. For Saba, of how she might find her place after marriage in a family in which Hindu and Muslim identities have stood in an ambiguous relationship. This particularly with the way that Kuldeep's grandfather and father have the capacity through dreams to engage with Islam in a certain way, though they be Hindus in their religious practices. Uh, so the relationship in his household between Hinduism and Islam is not a straightforward one, in other words. But also for Kuldeep, what unexpected attractions Islam might hold, something that he had not anticipated before his relationship with Saba. Each member of the family, Das says, gets an opportunity to learn how to inhabit this newness with its ordinary and extraordinary moments braiding into one another. We can see here then that in this way, everyday life remains, despite the absence of a momentous event, everyday life remains this kind of crucible in which incremental changes, gradual changes, accretions over time can produce the possibility of newness. Sense of the ordinary, which Das draws from Cavell, starts from a sense that in everyday life, we may not be awake or alive to ourselves or our lives, which raises the question of what it may be to become awake to one's life, which is in turn a matter of becoming attentive or attuned to the small details of one's life. This attentiveness to minute shifts in actions and dispositions is one way in which to inhabit the everyday. One sees something like this in the changes Kuldeep's mother notices through the mediation of her mother goddess, or in what Saba tries to bring about in herself so that she can connect to Kuldeep's childhood. Again, these are ways of awakening or discovering things about oneself that had previously remained obscured. Even as Kuldeep, with his tendency to misrepresent his achievements, for example, saying that he had a scholarship for a much more prestigious technical college that would lead to something like an engineering degree rather than a technical degree, or to avoid repaying his debts, is hard to picture as a model of morality. The possibility for newness, nonetheless, emerges with his love for Saba. This is the possibility that, even when the national rhetoric is vitiated by a vision of a strong Hindu state in which the presence of Muslims is barely tolerated, a small community of love can come about and, at least in some lives, break the solidity of oppositional identities. It is important to note that Kuldeep and Saba's improvisations depended on the improvisations of others, like Kuldeep's mother, like his grandfather and his father, much as the improvisation of one musician occurs within the improvisations of all the band members. Das adds, though, that these improvisations motivated by love can come at a cost. The security of one's identity in that experimenting with the other's religion entails giving up one's own identity as simply Hindu or simply Muslim. And of course, this is something that you give up without knowing ahead of time what is going to become of you when you engage in this experimentation. Given the everyday struggles of this household, Das sees the work of opening oneself to alternative ways of receiving the other as profoundly moral. Even before marriage, she says, there were indications in this household that Hindus and Muslims are not completely locked inside their identities. Perhaps this instability constitutes the condition of possibility for such love to be born and to find a home. It is a picture of the moral in which we might lose the profundity of moral statements through which much of philosophy, theology, and religion stages the moral. What we gain is the simple capacity to inhabit the everyday and to perform the labor of discovering what it is to engage the life of the other. One implication of the picture that emerges from this focus on everyday ethics is that terms like the Hindu worldview or the Islamic worldview leave no room to detect or explore the sorts of moral projects that Saba, Kuldeep, and their families engage in. They're too broad, too coarse in a way to pick up on these kinds of subtleties. Remaining attentive to the potentials for hurt and for care in Hindu and Muslim memories of one another, varying in intensity as they do within the broader political projects connected to Hindu-Muslim identities, at one and the same time throws into question the stability of binary oppositions like faith and ideology, and the conviction that spanning the Hindu-Muslim divide are doomed. It's in other words, not programmatic in that way. That there might be more opportunity for newness than the worldview approach would allow one to see. Instead, Das says, we might pay attention to the manner in which moral striving shows up in everyday labors of caring for the other, even in context where a mutual antagonism defines the relation, where one locked in conflict with the other at one threshold of life might find that there are other thresholds of life in which one becomes, despite all expectations, attracted to that other. Now, I want to add a final note to bring back the point that I was raising right at the beginning. In the last book that Cavell published while he was still alive, titled "Little Did I Know," he recalls the bitter resistance that his early work faced within philosophy, not least because he was willing to take things like classic films, autobiographies, the plays of Shakespeare as locations for philosophizing. And the resistance to this was brutal. I think that Das is doing something similar in this work. That is, exploring how places and goings on that seem too ordinary to merit philosophical attention are, after all, rich sites for thinking about ethics and morality. So again, that the descent into the everyday provides us with opportunities to consider ethics and morality in revealing, robust ways. Thank you very much. And that's it.